Hi, and once again, we're here at Off the Cuffs. I'm Bobby Kimbrough. Today we have with us is Dr. Ford, the pastor at First Baptist. I'm very honored and grateful to have you here. Doc, welcome to the show. No introduction needed. Glad to have you.
I'm so glad to be here. It's a real honor.
I appreciate that. What we normally do is when we have a guest here, most people know our guest, some don't. Most know you. Tell us about who is Dr. Ford. I know you're relatively new in the city, but I've seen you since you arrived. You're a stakeholder, very powerful man in the city. So tell us a little bit about you and how you ended up here.
Well, I was born and raised in the Upper West Side of Manhattan in New York City. Lived there for the first 20 years of my life. Left there, over 20 years ago, and since then have lived everywhere from small town Iowa to Chicago to Cambridge, Massachusetts, serving in ministry. The Lord led me down here in the fall of 2017 to be the 11th pastor of the oldest Black Baptist church in the city. And so I've been there officially for 2 years as of November of this year. And really, anywhere I go in ministry, I go with a mindset to serve in whatever way my work is needed to advance the politics of Jesus in that community. And so for Winston, that has been around educational equity issues as well as a few other issues because the need is so great there because of just the legacy of segregation and plantation politics here in this city. The church has received the ministry real well. I am an outsider, whatever that means to people. But I always tell folks, I may not be from here, but I'm here to serve. I'm here to help. So if you're willing to receive that, we can work together.
I like that. I know you've been here for about 2 years. I welcome you to the city of Winston.
Thank you.
You addressed a few issues just in the introduction about some of the things that were going on, social equity, the politics and religion, and then you use the word plantation politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. When
you say that and the things that are going on inside the city of Winston-Salem, having been a travel man and versed in a lot of things, do you see the same thing going on here you see across the country, or you see it from a different perspective?
In some ways. I mean, there are issues that are kind of universal, first of all, to the human condition, which is just kind of a theological reality. There are issues that are universal to urban or semi-urban and certainly communities of color across the nation because the history of white supremacy and racism in this country and the way that this kind of race-based capitalist society has operated in America. And then there are things that are particular to certain localities. When I, use that phrase, plantation politics, I'm a student of history, so one of the things I did as soon as I got here was invested myself deeply in the history, specifically of the church that I serve, but then also branching out from that into the history of Winston-Salem, particularly the history of the Black community in relation to the rest of Winston-Salem, because First Baptist history really tracks alongside the history of the Black community in Winston. And, it quickly became clear to me that, until the past 30 or so years, this city really was one big tobacco plantation, tobacco and textile plantation run by the Reynolds and Haynes families. And the history seems to be somewhat unique in the arrangements, for lack of a better term, that they had, with a lot of the Black community and whatnot, paid the workers better than other places around the state and all of that. But in exchange, there was an expectation that there wasn't going to be quite as much, unrest, wasn't going to be quite as much rocking the boat, rustling the feathers, because it very much was kind of an implicit quid pro quo. The consequence of that, the collateral consequence of that, is that it's clear to me that certain issues that are fundamental to moving the needle on inequity, for instance, certainly inequity as it relates to education, inequity as it relates and expresses itself in the disproportionate poverty rates on, say, the East Winston versus other parts of the city, that those issues have not been tackled at those root levels because of the arrangement that was in place, until the fall of the tobacco industry and kind of the shifting power centers, and that only now there seems to be a wind to move some of those, from the educational equity side. He talked about this with Dr. Eversley, late Dr. Eversley, who said 25 years ago, you pass this school choice policy, the schools are going to be resegregated. He said that 25 years ago. Here we are 25 years later. That's exactly what happened, right? That was part of a larger movement and reflective of things that were happening around the country in terms of the resegregation, of our schools. But when I have looked at the lack of voices really pushing the bill at times around certain issues and tried to understand why, coming from where I come from, born and raised in New York City, and what I told people is that just about every city in this country that's got a couple dozen black people has Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard or Drive somewhere.
True.
I come from a city that has a Malcolm X Boulevard. It's just a different mindset. It's a different mindset. It's a different approach to how you talk about issues, how in your face you're willing to get about stuff, how much you're willing to call people on the carpet in no uncertain terms. Part of the reason why folks were never able to appropriate Malcolm X's legacy in the way that many people have tried to appropriate Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy is because Malcolm X didn't mince words in what he was talking about and calling it like he saw it. And it did not lend itself to people being able to try to massively misinterpret and reinterpret, things that he said the way corporate America was doing at one point, trying to use King's I Have a Dream speech to sell computers. It was insanity, You can't do that with Malcolm X's language and mentality. And so it's a different mindset, that I bring to these situations that I see here. It's a certain unapologeticness, and I do see some shifting happening just in the 2 years that I have been here. But I think there's so much further that we have to go.
So when you say the inequity and the things that you mentioned inside the city or inside the county, do you think that is a cause of some of the issues that we're having in the city?
Of course. I mean, inequity is at the root of so many of the discontentments that we see within communities. When you talk about crime within certain sectors of our community, when you talk about the disproportionate kind of appearance of poverty in certain communities, when you talk about the achievement gap, when you talk about disproportionately high rates of unemployment, when you talk about broken families, all of this stuff can be rooted in and centers in questions of historic inequity and the ways in which the scales of justice were designed by what Nicole Hannah-Jones called an intentional architecture when she was here not too long ago, to be tipped in favor of one group and really set to be there, and in the disfavor of a whole nother sector. And so the long-term consequences of that is that you have the group that has been in this unfavorable position for so long showing the impact of that. And it translates into all of the examples that I mentioned.
So you and I can agree that, I think a lot of us can agree that there's inequity within the city in certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
We won't mix words on that.
Mm-hmm.
We agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
We will agree that it is affecting the crime rate. We will agree that it affects this whole society within this city.
Mm-hmm.
But the question that I've been having this morning and the whole weekend and all last week is that I know there are some issues within the city. I know we have issues within this country.
Mm-hmm.
How do we fix them? How do we move forward? As you said, you've seen some movement in the 2 years that you've been here.
Mm-hmm.
What's the blueprint? What's the road forward? How do we push this forward faster than what we're seeing?
Right.
From your perspective.
Right. So there's two things to keep in mind. I was talking about some of this recently at Knollwood Baptist Church. One of them is to understand that if we're talking about scales of justice that have been tipped in such an uneven way for so long, we have to go about evening those scales. If we understand that there is an intentional architecture to the inequity that exists, then we have to be just as intentional about redesigning the system in such a way where the scales are evened out and there is equity. And one of the key things that we have to keep in mind that people are starting to come around to is that there is a difference, a fundamental difference, and it's a critical difference between the rhetoric of equality and a mindset that is preoccupied and obsessed with equality and understanding that equality is not the same as equity. And in this country, because of the mythology, around the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, life, living, pursuit of happiness, and all this sort of thing, inalienable rights, all men are created equal, et cetera, there's always been an obsession with the language and the rhetoric and programs focused on equality. But again, you cannot talk about equality if you are starting from a point where one group is so far behind because the scales have been tipped out of their favor for so long, right? And another group has been so far ahead for so long. You can't just say, all right, now there's equality. Now group that's been behind, you can run the same race that we've always ran, because they're not starting from the same point. You would not have a race start and have Paul Ford start from 300 yards back or where Bobby Kimbrough starting from and say, hey, man, you had just as good a chance, Paul Ford, to win that race. No, I didn't. I started from 300 yards back, right? And so the rhetoric of equality leads people to believe that, well, once we get rid of all the laws around, segregation, or once we get rid of all the laws that enable restrictive covenants, or, once we create school choice and anybody can go to any school, and once we get rid of laws that supported segregation in the workplace and all that, it's all equal now. So what are you black folk, what are you brown folk, what are you poor folk complaining about? You have the same access that I always had. Yeah, but the problem is starting from so much further back. And so equity is a question of how do we make things right? Equality is always about how do we make things equal. Equal isn't good enough. Equality was never enough, right? It was always about equity, making things right, because things were made wrong for so long. So when you talk about it in terms of the education system, one of the most important takeaways, unsurprisingly, that came out in the Cohan-Jones speech she gave at the Carol Williams Auditorium not too long ago, came during the question and answer session. Some of the best stuff you're going to get from speakers is actually going to come out of the question and answer session. It's not even going to come out of their prepared remarks. And a question was asked around what advice she would give to somebody who was interested in becoming a teacher. And she worked through and around that question to the point of saying, I am hoping for and imagining a day when the black and brown schools that are suffering these huge achievement gaps and these other inequities that translate in other kinds of ways are so heavily flooded with resources that all the white folks will want their kids to be coming there. And I said it, Norwood, I'm talking about a flood of biblical proportions, right? I'm talking about a flood that unmakes the world as we know it now, that is based on and designed around this inequity, and remakes it. So some people will look and say, well, why are you saying that the black and brown schools should be getting more resources than the schools over here on this side of town? Yes, unapologetically yes, right? Absolutely yes. Why? Because for so long, the resources were segregated, okay?
But when you say that, right, I know some folk out there listening saying, well, just based on that premise, if we unmake this world, unmake what we have right now, our values, our systems, the equity, we talk about the equality. How do we do that? And when you put that framework out there, how would you do that? Because just like you said, the guy who's sitting here with all this money and all this power, who has access and resources, and now you're talking about unmaking something. Now you're talking about redivvying up something. How do you get to that place? As I sit every day when I come in here, come into work, I know that we have issues in this city. I know that. I'm a product of here. I've traveled a few places and come back home. And I know in my mind, I could be wrong, but I don't see the system unmaking itself. I don't see the system saying there's too many powers that be to come in and say we're going to unmake it. My hope is that, and I say this all the time, and I've said it publicly, is that she's not what she used to be. She's not what she used to be. Mm-hmm. She's not what she could be. When I say she, I'm meaning America. She's not what she could be. But I do see, and I have seen in my lifetime, I've seen progression. I've seen progress. I've seen steady progress. And I struggle with every day is, how do we save lives? How do we educate? How do we fill that void, that gap that I see at some of the schools, as you speak about, that don't have the resources? How do we fill that gap of a 13.9 difference of a lifespan on this side of town versus on this side of town? How do we close those gaps? How do we bring resources, access, money, and things that we need to a particular area? I go to a school every Thursday, and I work at this school. I volunteer there every Thursday. I have a group of young men that I work with, and I'm amazed at what they say to me when we first start out. I'm amazed that they've never been outside of the city limits of Winston. I'm amazed at the conversations that we have. And so I struggle every day like you. How do we fill that void? How do we give them a better than what we saw before?
Right.
Is it possible?
Of course it's possible. And the work that you're doing, volunteering at that school every Thursday, even if you're not able to fully appreciate it as you're doing it, is having a huge impact on the lives of those young men, right? One of the realities that you're encountering is that poverty and growing up in poverty makes people's worlds very small.
True.
Because you will encounter that all over the country. People who've grown up in poverty and have never left their neighborhood, or maybe only left to go see grandma and grandpa, happen to live in the country, whatever the case might be, have not, do not have a wider world view because there simply hasn't been the access and the opportunity because of the types of inequities that, produce poverty. So there's little things that we can do, in terms of scholarships and resourcing that is targeted at those communities to give those kids a way out. But the wider question of unmaking the world as it is, remaking it to what it should be, is always about making sure that we are keeping our eyes on the prize and setting our sights on the highest goal that should be, right? Understanding the lifelong, you and I may not see it in our lifetime process that has to be taken together. There's an old African proverb, jump at the sun, at least you'll land among the moon and the stars. You don't want to jump at the moon and the stars because you might land beneath those, right? So that we always want to keep our goals set at the highest point at which they should exist, the top of the mountain, okay? Understanding that depending on how far back things are from the starting point, it's going to take a step-by-step, everybody leaning in, putting in process over an extended period of time to make change. And some people will look at that change and call it incremental. But if you string together, if it's led by a vision, if it's guided by a vision, if there is an intentional redesign going on, you string together those incremental changes, they are going to begin to affect the baseline of where everything is. I think you're absolutely right that a great deal of progress has been made, but the other reality is that the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was the backlash, or better yet, the white lash to Barack Obama having been elected president in 2008. And I sat around with some folks here, recently talked about situations here in the county who are very concerned, and I share their concern, that there's going to be a white lash in terms of the school board here in this county in the next election cycle in 2022. Because for the first time in years, some people would tell me even more than that, we elected a majority pro-equity school board that has made demonstrable moves in favor of equity. We know there is a certain sector of people who are not happy about that. And as you alluded to earlier, there are people with money, with power, with assets, with resources, right? Bible says that to whom much is given, much is required, right? So when folks say to me, well, there's a lot of people with money and power and assets, and they're not trying to give that up, I said, that's not enough for me to say, well, so we need to kind of shift to a different tactic. No. I mean, this is why Jesus spent so much time talking about how hard it was going to be for rich people to get into heaven. And it wasn't him saying rich people are damned because they're rich. What he was saying is that, unfortunately, so many rich people worship at the idol of mammon, wealth. They cannot shift to worshiping God, right? Which means having a disproportionate concern for who he called the least of these, the sick and the hungry and the naked, and the poor and the incarcerated and the stranger, a.k.a. the migrants at the border that Trump is leaving there to die, right? Because those are the ones who are disproportionately undervalued by this world as it is. So therefore, if you are following this God who Gustavo Gutierrez has a preferential option for the poor, then you need to be trying to, again, make things right and even out the scale. So that I would say to the question of how are we going to shift this when people are so invested, it takes a change of heart and mind, and it takes a public will. We think about these conversations around, well, we don't have enough money to do this, or, you want to flood all of the black and brown schools with an overabundance of resources. Where are we going to find that money? The question's being asked now, well, where are we going to find the money for a new Ashley school until we have another bond in 2022 or 2024? We're not waiting for another bond, right? Because the bottom line is, at the federal level, at the state level, at the county level, at the local level, all throughout American history, people always find money for the things that are important for them. What budget was there for the war in Afghanistan? Was that built into the budget of the federal government? Was the budget for Iraq War I, Iraq War II built into the budget? Was carrying on in Afghanistan, basically occupying Afghanistan for 10, 12, 14 years? I think it's the longest, occupation that we've had, even surpassed Vietnam. Was that built into the budget? No, it wasn't. They found the money. Right. So I never accept the notion that, well, how are we going to do this? It's not within our means, or these folks are too entrenched. People need to become unentrenched. Right. And we have to keep on pushing that, understanding it's not going to happen overnight. You may die before it happens. I may die before it happens. I pray to God my children won't die before it happens, but that may happen, right? But we have to stay focused on holding on to the way things should be and advocating for it. Because if we ease up for a minute and ease up on the aspirations that we express and that we advocate for, don't you know the people who are invested in things as they are say, whew, all right, they done finally eased up on that. So we don't have to
When you
stress
say
so much.
we, right, I love that you're saying we, because I come from a perspective that the situation that we're in now is an all hands on deck.
Yeah,
it's got to be everybody involved. And so when I look around and I ask people, I say, what is going to be your role? What is your role? So my question would be to you is, like, everything that we see moving in this county, all those inequities that you spoke about, all those wrongs, all of the things that we don't have, what is going to be the role of the church in this?
Right. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. Because I constantly hear people love to just run their mouths about this on social media, complain about what the church ain't doing, what the church should be doing, pastors ain't doing nothing, blah, 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 blah. And I've been thankful that you have not framed your rhetoric that way as you have come around the community, just challenging folks to get more involved. The unfortunate reality is that we've got a whole lot more churches than we need to have in our communities by way of the fact that we've got a whole lot of churches that are just struggling to survive and keep their doors open institutionally. So there has to be a sober understanding of the condition and state of many of our churches. But then the next thing has to be understood.
Who decides that?
Well, unfortunately, the local people in a community decide that. Can't nobody tell no group you can't form a church, or you 5 people can't keep on trying to keep your one little podunk church open, just because those families that you represent have been a part of it for 100 years, even though the church, all but died 50 years ago and y'all have just been burying it member by member, right? Nobody can dictate that to anybody. People like myself can talk about it and preach it and say, look, at the very least, we need to be working in collaboration and coalition. In other cases, some of these churches just need to understand that a better day has passed and they need to find a different way to be in service to the community. There are different denominational structures that allow for more structure around that than others do. I say that as kind of a preamble and disclaimer that I think people have to be careful in assuming that every church on every corner in every neighborhood is even in position to do anything. That being said, there's a whole lot more that churches and pastors can be doing. One of the biggest things we have to leverage in churches like my own, large historic churches that have large facilities, is the facility, is the building. Come on in here and let's have that community meeting. I have every vision by God's grace to bring a preschool back into First Baptist, to expand our after-school program, particularly to target, our community here in East Winston that we have been serving, the black community we've been serving for all of the 140 years that we have been in existence. Churches can leverage, first of all, a moral voice into the conversation, because too often the conversation is limited by cultures that are corrupt and that have these low ceilings as to what can be done. The system's just too entrenched. People are too stuck. Church always has to be the one to say, no, that's not good enough. That ceiling is too low, right? That culture is too corrupt. We are called to a higher goal, an aspirational goal. This is what the Word of God says. This is what, Jesus teaches, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing. 2, churches are full of people who can do the little things, right? Whether it's, trying to organize your men to get more involved in going and doing the volunteering that you're doing in the schools, so that we're trying to fill the gap, particularly with children who are dealing, with a father hunger or fatherless syndrome or things of that nature. Whether it is doing simple things. I already told folks that I want to have the next luncheon for the street school kids that do so well. We're going to host that at the church because these kids work so hard. These kids are coming from so many difficult situations, and the church ought to be a place to open the door and say, come on, you're doing such a great job. I made a point as soon as I got to First Baptist to make sure that every single time we got to that point in the quarter where kids were getting report cards, I said, you bring those report cards in here because I want to acknowledge you from the pulpit and encourage you, right? Because it used to be that the church was focused just on building these kids up. Our youth ministry for years has made a point of going into the community and pulling kids out of that community into our church, even when the families aren't coming, because in this day and age, that's what you are often dealing with, right? The church can reach deep into these communities, can build relationships. All of that will be reflective of the resources that each individual church has, and that's why I made the comment I made at the front end of this set of remarks. But the other reality is that churches can do more and more and more to work together to maximize those limited resources in order to reach people. So there's a moral voice, and there's the boots on the ground from the people who you have in your church go into the schools and reach people.
I agree with that. When you say moral voice and boots on the ground, from my perspective, from where I sit, I have always viewed the church as, if not the most powerful entity in our society. Mm-hmm. I have. The church has power that does not recognize that it has. Mm-hmm. And when I say, what is the church role? When I say, what are we going to do about this from a community perspective? I don't believe nobody's going to show up and help us, because all that we need, we have right here. And like when I ride through this city and through this county, and I see, like you said, churches everywhere, everywhere. And some are not as strong as yours.
Absolutely.
Right? Absolutely. And so I ask myself, though, in this imaginary world that I live in some days in my head, I said, what would it be like if every church decides, you know what, we're going to adopt a school. We're going to adopt a Ashley. We're going to adopt a Cook. We're going to adopt a North Hills. We're going to adopt a Haynes. We're going to adopt schools where they have issues at. And while we may not have the money to do this, the sweat equity, the fatherless child, the little boy that when he see you walk in the church, walk in the building, that's Dr. Ford.
Right.
I mean, the presence that a man brings when he walks into a place.
Sure.
And so I see a lot of folk from where I sit, I'm not saying the church, but I see a lot of folk on the sidelines, and there's this gladiator sport taking place right there in the arena, and they're sitting there, and they don't have any, what I call skin in the game. They don't have any sweat in the game. They stand back and they observe when you have people out here every day trying to bring about this change that you're talking about. I mean, I think every second person that you stop on the street will tell you, I know the history of this country. I know the inequities that take place. I know all the isms that take place. But at the same time, my father was a product of R.J. Reynolds. He worked there 40 plus years, right? I remember Supervisor Mr. Bowles would come to our house on Saturdays. My mom was a cook, and my mom would cook fish and grits for him. And I would sit there and say, wow, my mom cooking fish and grits for this man, white guy, white man, my dad's supervisor, right? And my father would always tell me, he would say to me is that, son, you can't let your situation determine where you're going. You cannot. You can't let that you born and grew up right here in East Winston. You cannot let that America may not accept you.
Right.
You got to make them accept you. You make them accept you by putting the work in, putting the sweat equity in, then believing, just like you talk about this faith, this hope. And that's how I live my life. I mean, I'm 58. I've seen racism. I've been a victim of racism in my time. But I smile when I see it. I laugh in my mind, because I know that no one individual can stop me unless they kill me, right? Other than that, I know that I'm unstoppable with my faith and my mindset. But I hang my hat every day, and some days I get frustrated. I do. I get frustrated when I come in here and I see the numbers 800 residents across the street. I get frustrated when I see the number of bullets shot into a house, people dying, young men. And I get angry sometimes, and I say, because there's enough resources. Right. Forget suburbia, forget what they can do, but there's enough resources when they're within our own community to bring about change. Right. When I go to some of the churches that I was going through on the campaign trail, I saw in the African American church some of the wealthiest African Americans in this county going to those churches inside the city limits. And I ask myself all the time, if we really get tired and we really want to bring this, change this narrative of what's happening, we could do that. And I'm waiting on one day where I walk outside one day and I see people in droves at these schools working. I'm waiting for this thing where I see people walking up and down Liberty Street, East Winston, protesting the homicides that have taken place. I'm looking for this day when I see people saying, you know what, damn no snitching. I'm finna call and say, this is what happened. Right. I'm looking for the day when we all take accountability to say, you know what, I'm going to be a part of the solution today. I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to do this because I'm going to make a difference. Because if we don't, this place that we've arrived in America, it's going to be us to change it. It's going to be us to bring about it. And as you say, I've got to have that. I've got to bring it to you. I've got to say, you know what, these are the issues. Now let's go address them.
So two things, and you and I talked about this a bit on the panel that we were on at the Malloy Jordan branch of the library, right? One of the questions would be, why aren't people ready to say, damn those snitches, I'm going to go to the police and tell them, right? And despite the fact that, as some have said, this isn't Baltimore, this isn't Chicago, this isn't New York, this is a city that had its own history, and late Dr. Evans used to talk about it to me all the time, of difficulty, of race-based relations with the police, right? And so there is still work that has to be done in building greater trust between law enforcement and people in the community. Just one thing I just want to say about that. We got to build greater trust. The more guys like you and gals, so to speak, like Chief Thompson and whatnot, that are in positions of power with law enforcement, that are determined and dedicated to change the culture of accountability within the police department, to put people in uniform, because that's really the emphasis, is the kind of people you have behind the badge, behind the uniform, people in uniform out in the community who are seeking to build relationship in a non-confrontational, but just, brother to brother and sister to sister relationship in the community, the better. When you sat on that panel, you had been in a meeting recently where there was concern being expressed because I think the juvenile detention center, you said, was either running out of beds or they were going to need to look at building a bed. You remember I immediately said, time out. Anytime that conversation comes up, people got to say, wait a minute. If that's happening, every dollar that you're getting ready to go and find to build another juvenile detention center or to renovate and expand the beds of this current juvenile detention center, we need to be throwing into youth counseling, right? Into youth programming, into the things that actually, from an evidence-based perspective, this has been studied, this has been shown, this has been proven to work, actually have a success rate for intervening in a positive way in the lives of those that we call, at-risk youth. I know Fleming Elamine hates that term and whatnot, but those who are more likely than not, if the trajectory doesn't change in their lives, to end up walking into one of your facilities escorted by some of your deputies because they have committed some sort of crime, to reach them before that happens, right? And to help them turn their lives around.
Right. But see, here's what I'm saying is that the information that I was saying is that these are things that are really happening out there. Yeah. They're making plans for this. I'm not saying
and that's my problem.
Right. That's just like in any business, they've got to see what is the forecast saying, right? And I agree. I get what you're saying is that maybe we should be taking that money and putting it into programs. Mm-hmm. I get that. I'm hanging my hat on this right here is that all of us, every individual got to take accountability for what's happening in this space that we call home, this space that we're breathing in. When you talk about trust with the police departments, trust with the sheriff's office, I get that over our history it hasn't been a semiotic relationship with police and African Americans or brown and black people in America. I get that. I understand that. I know that firsthand, right? I've been stopped myself, right? Mm-hmm. So the point I'm trying to make is that right here in Forsyth County, I can't speak about nowhere else, but right here in Forsyth County, I can honestly say this without any hesitation or reservation that the man and the woman, or the men and the women that you have in leadership position in law enforcement here, whether it's Kernersville, Winston, or the sheriff's office, I can tell you from having worked with them that this, without question, is one of those situations to where I can assure you there will be accountability. Mm-hmm. I can assure you that we will be in the community, because in order for us to function in the community, I got to have credibility. Right. I can't go into East Winston or anywhere in this county and not have the credibility. When I go out on the streets, and I go out there quite often, I don't go out there with the intention of who can I arrest.
Right.
I go out there with the intention of whose life can I change by conversation. How can I gear? How can I change? How can I change this trajectory that we have entered into? In order for us to do that, we got to have all hands on deck. I got to have buy-in from all the system. I got to have it from the schools, from the private sectors, the businessmen, those that go to. I got to have it from the church. I've got to have it from everywhere, because I can tell you this. This is not a situation that we can lock away.
That's right.
It's not a situation that the police can handle on its own. It's not. Mm-hmm. There's not enough manpower. There's not enough men to be everywhere. When I say manpower, to be everywhere that there's a crime that's going to take place. Right. It's not. We've got to start to change some mindsets, some values, some morals, and that's going to take everybody. That's going to take you. That's going to take all of us. And so my hope is what I've said is that I'm looking for this day when all of us decide, you know what, this has gotten too far out of control. It's gone too far. We're going to do some things differently.
Right.
Right. If it takes us walking up and down the street saying, you know what, we're going to stop this. If it's going to take us walking up and down the streets at night.
Right. So let me say this, because, on New Year's Eve, moving from 2018 to 19, we were doing a joint watch night service at Piney Grove Baptist Church, Pastor Linville. And
good man,
absolutely, yeah. Good brother, absolutely, done a lot of good work in the community. And I preached a message that night for this service where towards the tail end I talked about the fact that I had great hope that with some of the shifts that were happening, particularly that were about to happen as a result of the election, the fact that you were one of, I think, 7 black, sheriffs elected around the state. We had Chief Katrina Thompson. We had other similar situations, flip the school board. Part of the problem that we've always had is that historically, the best that we could hope for, and excuse my transparency, was a couple of token Negroes to be elected to put into a white supremacist system. And then there was this notion we were going to pin all our hopes that because that one token Negro was there, now everything was going to change. And that was foolishness on our part. Just as much as it was foolishness to think that because we had a black president, he was going to fix everything for black America. We had the first black president ever still being elected, into a white supremacist government, right? And what I said was that my hope was that now, with having groups of black progressive-minded people elected, right, this was going to begin to create a critical mass, right, where now you're not just sitting at the table as the one black guy in law enforcement at a table with everybody else looking like not you and me, right? But you're actually sitting around the table and there's a collective mass of folks. And so now there is a conversation that can happen around changing culture and changing the way we do things. That's the greatest hope for manifesting some of the realities that you and I, because I share that hope, are hoping to see in terms of building greater trust. I can vouch for you personally in the community and not be worried that I'm going to end up looking like an idiot when a story comes out that you've been going around cracking people's heads, because I know you personally. I know your family. Your family's in my church, right?
Exactly.
So I can vouch for that, right? People that know Chief Thompson, others, they can vouch for these folks, right? And so the more that begins to happen, the more that we can begin to see that trust built. I will tell you right now, going back to what I said earlier in terms of there being proven methods that we just have to have the will to support, when it comes to increasing violence within our city, having spent 9 years in Chicago, having spent time in the Cambridge, Boston, great Boston area, there are ways to approach this. There are street outreach worker programs that have been proven to work when you are getting the right people, typically the ex-gangbangers, the ex-used to be in the street guys who have turned their lives around enough now that you can rely upon them and train them, and they already have the relationships that I will never have, that you may or may not have, to actually reach the folks in the community who are causing such a mess and who are dumping all kinds of bullets on people's front yards and killing kids, in the collateral consequence of it all. But that stuff has to be properly supported with dollars, has to be properly supported with resources from the community. People got to set aside egos and come together and say, we're going to throw them, we're going to do this. When I was in Chicago, I served as senior pastor there for 2.5 years. I was an associate in another church before that. I used to say to people, it really is a shame, and literally something we should be ashamed of, that we have all these churches in our communities here, and yet this homicide rate is still so out of control. I mean, we're getting stressed out because we've had 24, 25 homicides in Winston-Salem in the year so far. In Chicago, you can talk about 300, 400, 500 homicides in a year, right? And I said that, comparatively speaking, about proportions and all that. I know it's supposed to get out of hand proportionally speaking, but I said, outside of our regular Sunday services and the regular stuff we do, marrying and bearing people, every church needs to throw down and say, we're not doing anything else till we get together and shut down this violence in our communities.
That's where
now that's going to take willpower. It's going to take setting aside egos. It's going to take all kinds of others. I know I do, man.
Now because you know what? That's what I'm talking about.
And I'm ready to do that, man. I can tell you right now, Paul Ford, Senior Pastor of First Baptist Highland, is ready to throw down, but I can tell you right now, First Baptist can't do it by themselves.
Exactly. And that's the conversation that I keep going around. I'm having, because here's a promise that I've made to myself and made to God and to the people. I got to say this. I got to go back for a minute. So when I decided I was going to run, and I've said this many times, that this is the first time in my life that I'm free. Stay with me and I'll explain that. I'm free because I don't answer to, as a police officer, I had to be careful what I said because I could be fired for conduct unbecoming.
Right.
As a probation officer, I could have been fired if I said something that wasn't in line with what the general order was. As an agent with the federal government, I had to be extremely careful because not only could have been fired, I could have been arrested for talking classified and top secret information. But this is the first time in my life to where I answer to the people and God every day, and I don't give a damn what somebody else thinks about Bobby, because I've got to be true to myself, the people and God. And if I was the only person of color sitting in the room, I'm going to give them the truth. Because at the end of the day, I have hung my hat and promised I'm going to do what's right, not what's white, not what's Democrat. I got to do what's right.
Right.
Because part of the problem is that we have people, they won't speak what is truth. They won't speak truth. They want to address real issues. They want to address the elephants in the room. I have no problem with saying this is wrong. But then at the end, once we identify, I want to know what's the next question is, how do we come together and fix the problem? And you hit it on the head as we start to wrap up. I would love for that to happen, regardless of what your denomination was, whether it was a black church, a white church, Hispanic. It doesn't matter to me. Lutheran, Catholic, the synagogue, Muslim, it does not matter. I would love for all people of faith-based, to say, you know what, we're going to meet at the convention center, Coliseum, and we're going to devise a plan.
Right.
We ain't going to talk about nothing else till we say, how can we stop some of this and some of that?
Right.
Because it's going to take not only First Baptist, it's going to take all of us to stop what's happening. Right. As I rode around this weekend, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and saw and was a part of it, I was like, wow, how did we get here? But more importantly, how do we stop this? Like you say, we're losing. Why 24 is not what they're doing in Chicago, but comparatively, those are high numbers.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what, 2 a month. Yeah.
So the good news is, I'm not the only one.
And if it's my child,
of course, if it's your child, I mean that's the whole point.
We talk about a child. That's one too many.
That's right. We talk about it with the school system.
Right.
You know that you wouldn't let one of your kids languish in a Title I school, underachieving, low performing school. You wouldn't let one of your kids languish in there. So why is it okay for somebody else's kid to go there? The good news is that I'm not the only one who has this mindset. The bad news is there's not enough other pastors and preachers who demonstrate that mindset, right? And so you have to take that good news recognize that you don't need everybody to come on board.
We don't.
You just need a small cadre and contingent of committed people.
Can you get
to
that
come
cadre
on
for me?
board.
If you get that group of people, if you get that group of
You
pastors,
trying to give me more work to do, Mr. Sheriff. That's what you're doing.
No. You are a leader and a stakeholder in this community. You are a powerful man in this community. I know that from being a part of this community. If you bring your compadres and you tell me where we gonna meet at, we can really get something done.
You and I talk offline.
Let's do that. I would love that.
There are conversations that are starting to go on. All you need is a small, committed contingent of people. Margaret Mead had a great quote, and I can never remember it exactly, but she just said, don't fool yourself into thinking that it takes any more than a small group of people to change the world. That's all that's needed. Okay. I mean, you see what we did when those 3 regressive bills came out that were trying to disenfranchise voters and trying to take the power of the school board around school choice away and all of that. In a matter of basically a weekend, we brought together a coalition of people that, by all reports to me, from people who've been around this community for 20, 30 years, rarely ever happens, packed the house out at First Baptist and killed the bills. So we know we can do it. Okay. It takes the willpower, it takes setting the other stuff aside, and it takes focusing in. But there's enough people here who I think are willing to do it that we can move some weight.
But here's why I want to give you the last word before we close up.
It's your show. You can have it if you want.
No. You're a guest. You're a guest in our house, and we're going to treat you like a guest. What I have seen from sitting here for 11 months now is that it's going to take the folk on the east side of town, the folk on the west, the folk on the north, and the folk on the south. It's going to take all of us to do this, regardless of where we've been, regardless of our dislikes, regardless of race, color, creed, even sexual preference. It's going to take all of us to say, you know what? Because guess what? You hit it on the head. There are some folk that can go places that I can't go. There's some folk that's got things in their wheelhouse that I don't have. There's some folk over here that got resources that I don't have,
right?
A voice that I don't have. But when I bring all them together, all them to the table, yeah,
that's it, man. And that's the power of collaboration.
Inch by inch,
you look at the Boston Miracle, that I'm sure you're familiar with. The predecessor at the church that I pastored in Cambridge, Jeffrey Brown, had been a part of that Boston Miracle that came out of a period of insane violence that had culminated in a gang retaliation shootout in a church at a funeral for a guy who'd been killed because of gang violence. It happened because of a coalition of community leaders that came together, stayed focused, and sustained this effort over the course of a couple of years. Church leaders, law enforcement, criminal justice representatives, community organizations that could provide support services, all came together to reach those guys in the community, to let them know they were there to support them, but to also let them know they had to make a shift, because if they didn't, they had another lever they could pull that was going to pull them out of the community for a long, long time. It was miraculous and therefore became called the Boston Miracle, because that so infrequently happens, because people let petty stuff get in between that. It can happen here too. It can happen here too. I'm certainly ready to be a part of it. I know you are. And so you and I get together and we're going to try to make it happen.
I look forward to that. I want to thank you for coming by. I'm looking forward to this conversation offline.
Yes, sir.
I'm looking forward to black, white, all races take a page out of the Nissan commercial. I'm looking for the human race in this community to come together and say, hey, let's sit down. What resources do we need to help change our children's lives, our citizens' lives in this community, in this county? As always, it's a pleasure to see you.
You too,
I always enjoy talking with you. Look forward to seeing you again. And thank you for
It's a great honor.
Not
thank you so much, man.